A lot of these are very basic: maintain high quality core service delivery, recommended reserve levels, infrastructure maintenance, both street and stormwater, police department, city hall facility, outdoor park improvements, recruitment and retention challenges, vehicles, equipment, and technology, completion of the zoning code update, and then building reserves for vehicle and equipment. All of these things we've talked about in the last budget work sessions leading up to this evening. So these are the things that we need to think about as we continue to stay positioned for future success. Again, this is just a reminder on the front page of the budget and brief as well. The 5 questions that we've kind of used to shape our budget process for 2027. Where are we today? What has changed? What are we trying to accomplish? How should we invest the resources that we have? And how do we ensure long-term fiscal sustainability and resiliency for that? So again, as I mentioned, we haven't done it as much in the budget memos and presentations that you've heard up to this point, but we really tried to structure the budget and brief in response and answer to those 5 questions specifically. And then again, just touching on the key performance areas that you've established. They were established kind of several years ago, 5 key areas that really are intended to reflect the top priorities and objectives. They're very general, and each year we work to then think about how we are accomplishing things in each of these categories: infrastructure, sustainability, municipal operations. We talked a couple of weeks ago, I think, about how that's a pretty broad category, and moving forward, we may want to refine that a little more specifically and have some focus on some individual areas of operation, such as public safety, public works, et cetera, economic development, and then parks and recreation. Next slide. So this is just a recap on this slide of kind of the budget considerations for the major revenue streams that fund our general fund budget. Property tax is the largest of that. We're seeing continued strong collection rates, and valuation growth is moderating. We've talked about that, particularly in single family residential. That growth and that sector was under 3% for this year. Legislative changes that we think are coming in terms of property tax caps and large commercial appeals continue to remain concerns for us because, as you all are familiar, we've had some structural imbalances in our budgets because we've had property owners who have appealed their taxes, and we've had to refund those after they've been collected and oftentimes spent. The recommendation for the 2027 budget is to maintain the current mill levy, which is 22.025 mills. That generates about $231,000 in the 2027 budget for us. The next largest category is sales tax, both the city's sales and use tax, and then the portion of the county sales and use tax that we share. We're looking at conservative growth assumptions, only about a 2%. We're potentially seeing even some slowing. We're still meeting our budget projections, but we're not seeing the growth year over year that we have seen. So I think it's a good thing that we've been conservative in that realm, and we may experience that through the next couple of years. Again, because consumer spending is very sensitive to economic conditions. Redevelopment can help support the long-term growth of that. One of the things that we've talked about in the zoning code audit process is that in some respects, we are currently over-retailed because of the vacant retail space that we have. But many of those retailers are looking for more rooftops or bodies or consumers to be able to be in our community to spend their dollars here. Our goal always with sales tax is to avoid overly optimistic projections. And this is really just related to sales tax in the general fund. You'll recall that we do have a dedicated sales tax both for parks and recreation and for streets. So performance is good there, but those revenue streams feed exclusively into the capital improvement program for those dedicated projects and programs. Parks and recreation revenues are generated through memberships, admissions at the community center and the outdoor pool, program registrations, rentals, et cetera. Our challenge there is balancing affordability for our patrons with our cost recovery goals. We've set a cost recovery goal of at least 70%. We saw a deep decline in our cost recovery during the COVID period of COVID, we were down in the 30s. Prior to COVID, we had been at or slightly exceeding that 70% cost recovery goal. We are working our way back there. And I think we are up in the 67, 68% cost recovery range. So moving things in the right direction. And then we need to really start thinking about a plan for the expiration of that dedicated sales tax, as on the street side and the park side, but particularly on the park side, it's that those sales tax revenues that have allowed us to keep up with the maintenance at the community center and the MFAC, and to make the improvements that we've made over the last several years in our outdoor park systems. Sorry.
I just wanted to let people know that there are copies of the handouts too, if anyone in the audience wants up here, if it's hard to read.
I think they're probably good, but yes, they can have one. Franchise fees, as we know, that's just a percentage of utility fees, generally about 5%. It generates about $1 million. Again, still a significant revenue stream. Fines and forfeitures are those things collected through enforcement of local ordinances, primarily traffic. And then intergovernmental revenue is the county's share. It's a sales and use tax, but we count it in intergovernmental revenue. That's how it's reflected in the budget. We've had conversation about how the county did not move forward with renewal of a public safety sales tax that will expire in March of 2027. So we will take, depending on what they do and whether they share future revenues, that results in about a $200,000 a year reduction in revenues for our general fund. So we need to think about how to plan for that. This is just a breakdown. It's also included in the budget in brief for 2027. Our general fund revenues, the chart shows it by dollars and by percentage by category. Revenues are estimated at about $16.68 million. That's actually a 0% increase over 2026 estimated. So we are flat from the revenues that we're expecting to generate this year, even with a slight growth in underlying assessed property. 92% of the general fund revenues come from the 5 sources: sales tax, use tax, property tax, franchise fee, fines and forfeitures, and parks and recreation revenues. So we're very, very dependent, even though sometimes we want to look at some of those other smaller revenue streams, and they're certainly significant. We're only talking about 8% of the revenues coming into the general fund in any given year.
Or there is a typo that says 2020 if we have an online version of this instead of 2026 on the flat over.
On the which?
On 0%.
Oh,
increase,
yeah.
just to flag it maybe for the online.
There's another
this afternoon.
Proposed 2026 budget includes, and I think that should say 20.
It should. So I will fix those and we'll get them updated. Thank you. Then we look at general fund expenses by dollar and by function as well. So again, no surprise, I think, public safety, which includes police and municipal court, is the largest category of where our expenses go, followed by Parks and Recreation and Public Works are tied. I think the dollar chart here at the bottom, we just tried to take those general fund revenues for every dollar that comes into the general fund based on the expenses that are shown in the 2027 budget. You can see that 17 cents of that gets spent on administration, which includes our general overhead, which is things like insurance, premiums, utility bills for some of our city facilities. So it's the general overhead budget, the legislative budget, and the administration budget. Community Development Department is about 7 cents of that dollar. Parks and Recreation, 21 cents, Public Safety, 35 cents, and Public Safety, 35 cents, and Public Works, 21 cents. So 70 cents of every dollar goes into those 3 kind of functional core service delivery areas: Public Safety, Public Works, and Parks and Recreation. One of the things that I might then flip your attention to is if you'll turn to page 5 in the budget in brief. Page 4 was a worksheet that we developed last year. That's kind of a handy way to allow residents to calculate what their property tax liability is. For 2027, the average appraised value of a home in Mission, we recognize that varies, is $358,603. So you take your home's appraised value, you multiply that by 11.5%. That's your assessed value. You multiply that by the mill levy, divide that by 1,000, and that's your tax liability. So on the average appraised value of the appraised home in Mission, residents are paying $908 a year in city taxes. So when you break that down monthly, that average monthly property tax is about $75.66. Again, that's going to vary based on the appraised value of your home. So the higher the appraised value, the higher that you're going to pay in taxes. But then we want to look at, and I didn't include it in the slide, but how do Mission's property taxes compare to your overall tax bill? So when you look at that sort of dollar breakdown, for every dollar that a Mission homeowner pays in taxes, 19 cents of that comes to the city of Mission. The biggest portion, about 44 cents of that, goes to the school district. Then Johnson County, both through the county proper, Johnson County Parks and Recreation, and the Johnson County Library collectively receive about 21 cents out of that dollar. Consolidated Fire District receives about 9 cents. And Johnson County Community College receives about 7 cents. We didn't add in, you pay property tax to the state as well, but that's minimal. So we wanted to just kind of show, I think oftentimes our residents and businesses feel like the largest tax burden is coming from the city on their tax bill. And when you really look at what percentage of that overall tax bill we represent, it tells a little bit of a different story in that fashion. I'm going to flip back then to the presentation. One of the things that I know you all like to see every year is how does our proposed mill levy compare to other cities in Johnson County? What we've done is on the top half of this table, you're going to see cities throughout Johnson County who have fire service included under their city umbrella, okay? And so in order to really show you an apples to apples comparison, it's important for us to, those of us who are served by Consolidated Fire District number 2, to add that mill levy in addition to the city's mill levy so we can kind of see that comparable comparison. So you can see that of the cities that are served by Consolidated Fire District number 2, Mission does have the second lowest mill levy overall. Prairie Village is slightly above us, but Mission Hills, Roland Park, Fairway, and Westwood all have higher mill levies than the city. In large part, I think, and we had this conversation, I believe, last year, you look at Merriam, whose assessed valuation is fairly comparable to the city of Mission's. But if we think about their largest revenue generator, which is sales tax, and primarily the sales tax generated by the sale of automobiles, it's not just the balance and the revenue diversification and the revenue mix is dramatically different. So I think it's important to remember that in smaller geographic areas like the cities in Northeast Johnson County, we're still paying and our residents still expect a really high level of service. And we just don't have as many square miles, as much assessed valuation to be able to generate some of those revenues on. And sometimes, the city of Westwood, for example, when you look at their mill, I mean, one mill for them generates about $50,000. So when you think about how you pay for city services, and I believe they're looking at a 2 mil, I can't remember. Yeah, that's in the number. Fairway's looking at a 4 mil increase for the 2027 budget, and Westwood, who approved a 4 mil increase last year for the 2026 budget, is looking at an additional mill levy increase for 2027. One of the things that we did a little bit differently in the budget process this year, and we presented some of the options. I mean, we sort of internally as a staff work through as much of the number crunching as we can before we bring you a first draft. We don't always like to completely solve that algebraic equation because we think it's important for you to understand where the policy choices might be. So this year we presented those policy choices in budget decision packages, several of which have been incorporated into the recommendations for the 2027 budget, really to address specific recommended supplemental improvements, not basic operations. And again, it gave us the opportunity in a little bit different and I think more clear format to really highlight benefits and trade-offs as you considered those decision packages. Next slide. Would you like some budget materials? I didn't realize I should have turned the other way, Mayor. Okay, next slide. These guys hear me all the time. They don't. General fund reserves, this is just a snapshot of, and a reminder that the council has established a general fund balance policy of 25% of annual general fund revenues. That's exclusive of sort of one-time revenues. So we don't over reserve on things that we know are just a one-time revenue. But this does provide us flexibility to sort of help balance out peaks and valleys in the budget cycle, helps us to mitigate revenue shortfalls and to ensure stable tax rates. So this is just a snapshot that says we're meeting or exceeding that 25% fund balance goal. We know that is certainly a very high priority for the council.
And Laura, that does potentially impact expenses as well, because you flagged here that it can have an impact on bond ratings.
It
So if we
can.
were to deplete that fund, there would be higher costs to borrow for
Correct.
major projects, et cetera.
And in some earlier budget presentations, we actually were showing you about a 10-year history of fund balance, and you saw some really high fund balances in, I think, 21 and 22. That was the result of ARPA funds that were designated from the federal government. And we had some high general fund balances prior to that because we were intentionally reserving as we went through the litigation associated with the transportation utility fee and not knowing what any settlements might look like as a result of that. So we're through all of that now. And we felt like it was probably more realistic to show you just the last sort of 5-year snapshot of where we are. Next slide, please. So that really is kind of encapsulates our general fund. We aren't adding or eliminating any positions. We are looking at a classification and compensation study. As we've talked about in previous budget work sessions, one of the things coming out of the retreat was recruitment, retention, and succession planning for our organization. And we have not done a comprehensive classification and compensation study since 2017, slight update in 2021. So it's time for us to do that. I think we've done a pretty good job of keeping up, but certainly we can't do the things that we do without qualified, competent employees. So we want to make sure that we can stay competitive in that regard. The 2027-2031 capital improvement program, as we were talking about before, is a 5-year program. The current budget year is really the only one that is significant, has any significance to this annual budget process. But we do like to look at, because the infrastructure projects tend to be larger in scope, the price tags are larger, and we need a much longer runway in order to be able to plan both in the design and the acquisition of and decisions about how we fund those improvements. So it's very helpful for us to look at that on a 5-year horizon as opposed to just an annual basis. I was sharing with Amy earlier that the $6 million, for example, in STP funding that we've received for Johnson Drive, we actually secured back in 2022. And so our goal is we get that money, and then we got to figure out how by 2026 we can get all the way to funding a $13 million project. We really divide our CIP program into 3 areas that you all are familiar with: stormwater, streets, parks and recreation. Revenues coming into the stormwater program area include our stormwater utility fee, which is assessed on every developed property within the city of Mission. Single-family residential property is pays a stormwater utility fee of $336 a year. Commercial properties pay based on, and that's based on 2,600 square feet of impervious surface. That's an average or an estimate for a single family property. For commercial properties, we apply that, we look at and we measure how much impervious surface they have, rooftops, parking lots. And we break that into 2,600 square foot increments and then charge them accordingly. So many of our large commercial properties are paying tens of thousands of dollars in stormwater utility fees. And that's been a really important revenue stream, particularly following in the early 2000s when a lot of property throughout the community was put in the 100-year floodplain. And we've been investing in those improvements since then. And we know we have like last night as I was lying in bed listening to the rain, and I think about what sinkholes might be forming, as I'm sure that Ms. Boyce and Mr. Morton are as well.
Yeah.
So we're trying to catch up with that. We look at special assessment revenues. I think you're all familiar that currently the only special assessment we have is on the Gateway site. That is delinquent. It would be brought current. We anticipate that there will be some resolution of that litigation at some point in 2027, and those taxes and fees would be brought current. And then drainage district revenues. So our annual local revenues for 27 are about $4.5 million. That's slightly higher than normal because we're anticipating that $1.5 million in delinquent special assessments on the Gateway. I need to take out that without Gateway assessment. And then other revenues are $9.2 million, and that's reflective of this Johnson County Stormwater Management Program contribution and funding for the Rock Creek Channel project, and some other SMAC dollars that are available for street projects. Street revenues, we have a portion of the gas tax distribution from the state. It's about $250,000 a year. We have our 3/8 cent retail sales tax, which is generating somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1.1 million, 1.2 million. And then general fund mills dedicated to street repair and maintenance. So we take in the 2027 budget, we're proposing to take $750,000 of property tax revenues, transfer that to the street program to help continue to advance. Over the last, I think 10 years or so that we've been doing that, we've sent more than $11 million in property tax revenues into the street program to supplement the work that we are doing there. Other revenues look low on an annual basis for 2027 because it's the Null Cars project primarily. The big other revenues are reflected in the 2026 budget currently with the federal grant funding and the county CARS dollars on the Johnson Drive project. And then Parks and Recreation revenues, again, we have a 3/8 cent retail sales tax, and then 1/3 of the alcohol distribution that we receive from the state, which is about $150,000, goes into, so a third to the general fund, a third to Parks and Recreation, and a third to a special alcohol fund. And those funds are used for treatment and prevention of substance abuse. So annual local revenues in 2027 and the park CIP are about 1.23 million. And then other revenues, about $151,000. So that's reflective of the alcohol tax. For the major program expenditure highlights in the CIP in 2027 on the stormwater side, our Rock Creek Channel improvements. That's roughly a $15 million project from Woodson to Maple. We thought that was going to kick off this year, and that's moved a little slower than we anticipated. But we are now, I think, generally complete with utility relocation agreements, so that work can start. And then I think we are planning to bid maybe before the end of the year, if we can. What? That's the goal, yes. And then regular maintenance projects, again, we budget about $450,000 a year for replacing corrugated metal pipe, CMP. That's what causes a lot of the failures and the sinkholes that we see around the community. And then stormwater debt service, which all of our existing stormwater debt service will be paid off by 2029. So all of the existing stormwater debt service actually pays off in this upcoming 5-year capital improvement program. Streets in 2027 is our 3.97 million, our annual residential street maintenance program, which the council has committed at least $2 million a year annually to that. Johnson Drive, Lamar to Metcalf, it's going to lap over, although the dollars aren't shown there. We're going to be finishing that up in 2027. Miscellaneous repairs, striping, curb and gutter work, and then debt service associated with street projects. On the Parks and Recreation side, there's about 1.3 million. That's not all of the projects. There's a listing of the projects included in, I think, the August 5th committee packet, but there's updates coming to the family changing rooms on the pool deck at the Powell Community Center. And we're going to move forward with the conceptual planning process for both Anderson and Broadmoor parks, reinvigorate those, re-engage the community in what they'd like to see in those parks. Parks maintenance, as we make the improvements in the park, the council has been committed and dedicated to making sure that we have the staff and the resources to maintain the things that we're putting in. And then again, Parks and Recreation debt service. Next slide. Primarily in our capital improvement program is where you see us leveraging outside resources. And if we just look at the outside resources that we've secured, is this really since 2020 or did we only look at 2025? We're bad at changing headings.
I didn't know if you changed the fact.
I did not. I will fix that. So really since 2025, we've leveraged that number did not get changed. It's $19.5 million in federal, state, and county funds. As you know, and you encourage us to pursue grant opportunities anytime we can. The challenge is making sure that we are going to have whatever matching funds might be required in order to maintain that grant. The big one that we're waiting on right now, which we have successfully secured through another grant, the matching funds, or the majority of the matching funds, is for about $1 million worth of improvements coming out of the Safe Streets for All study, and looking at beginning to implement those projects throughout the community.
Laura, I don't think this year we've touched really on our kind of debt service philosophy, even though you've mentioned, debt service payments. And so I was just wondering if you could briefly speak to that in terms of tackling bigger projects, then also things that might have a longer term benefit for time.
Obviously, when you look at our budget, and so if we just take a couple of the projects that we've talked about this evening and we say Johnson Drive and Rock Creek Channel improvements, both somewhere between $13 and $15 million a piece. If you look at the general fund revenues that are coming in, that would be a whole year's budget for us. So as a smaller community, when we face those larger projects, we don't have the ability to cash flow those in a particular year. And in part, sometimes even on a smaller scale project, because the grants tend to be reimbursement, we upfront the money and then we get reimbursed. So we have to make sure that we have the cash available to do that. So oftentimes we will look at and we'll solve for how much other people's money can we bring to the table? What do we think on an annual basis? As I mentioned, like the STP, we secured that in 2022. So how do we start making sure we're reserving and not overspending on other projects to get there? And then we look at how do we fill that gap? Do we defer projects? Do we look at debt financing? The council does have, and you haven't looked at a debt policy in a while, but generally we try to look at a debt horizon or a repayment period of no longer than 10 years. There are a few exceptions that we've made to that. And that if we make an exception, that's based on the useful life of the asset that's being financed. So for example, stormwater improvements have been something in some cases that we've extended beyond that 10-year horizon because they're going to have a 50+ year lifespan or horizon. But again, stormwater debt is rolling off. All of the other debt that we have right now is set up on that 10-year horizon. But, as you all have heard me say, every time we bring forward a bond issue, we aren't ever going to recommend debt financing unless we can also bring you the method in which we're going to repay that debt. So it's easy to think about having that money there. But we do have to make sure we can make those annual debt service payments.
And that is one benefit of our dedicated sales tax revenue streams, as well as our stormwater utility fee, right? Is having that dedicated.
Yes, that
Yeah,
helps.
sure.
The other thing is when you look at general fund reserves, the general fund is the only fund that we really specifically hold reserves in. So, and because it's unlimited, if we found ourselves in a situation, we have not, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't at someday. You could use general fund reserves to cover a shortfall on a street project or a stormwater project or something, and then repay those over time or look at those other things. So that's another reason to sort of carry that. I think as we were researching other policies, reserve policies vary typically anywhere from 20 to 30%. So we're kind of right in that target range, but it helps us to have that little extra cushion because that is the only fund where we're reserving. And I will update that slide. Maybe I'll have time before the council meeting. Then we just highlight a few other funds. We have approximately 19 separate funds that we manage and budget for every year. Many of those are dedicated to a specific purpose. They're a fiduciary fund. So we really hit on the general fund each year, the funds that feed into the capital improvement program, which would be the sales tax funds. All of those are segregated as well. But then we have a few other funds that we like to just highlight each year. The MCVB fund is a fund that was established to account for, it's required statutorily to account for transient guest tax revenues. So we do have one hotel on the northern end of town that generates some transient guest tax revenues for us. Primarily, we've used that to support the Mission Magazine. Those revenues have to be used to sort of attract people into your community for an economic development purpose. So showcasing our businesses, allowing our businesses to have an affordable method for advertising has sort of met that goal. We've used it, dedicated funding to support businesses, for example, through our business improvement grant program, on other things like that. We also have the special alcohol fund, which I did touch on just a moment ago. That's a third of that alcohol tax. Right now, we're currently spending about $75,000 of that. And somebody else may have to take this over. Can you do the rest of this slide while I go choke for a minute?
Suppose you're stuck with the B squad now, at best. So just going through some of the other funds, as Laura was alluding to, the special alcohol fund, about half of that goes to UCS, which oversees that drug and alcoholism, the council, and allocates those dollars accordingly. So it kind of acts as a pass through in that front to, like I say, let us off the hook. But it fulfills our obligation by passing those funds on to them, which was what those alcohol funds are designated to do. As well as we use that for the mental health co-responder program. And then the last one she didn't really get to yet, I believe, was solid waste utility fund. And so that's one that we looked at this year just because we hadn't changed the rate on that since 2022. And so that contract has a built-in escalator each year. So the city portion had been going up, up, and up. So that was one of the decision packages, just to go ahead and increase that a few dollars a month, just to kind of make that rebalance that a little bit. Oh, so with those funds, they're designated for all of those incentive programs. And so in order for us, it's really more of an internal thing to track all of those specifically for each project. We have the designated funds for those, and that's what those run through. So while we don't really carry balances in there per se, they're just kind of like a hold for those projects, as TIF revenues come in a few times a year from the county, and then we validate the expenses, then they go out to the projects. Same for CID when the sales tax distributions come in. And so that's what it really contributes to that list of 19 that Laura was referring to. We do one for each project. So if you go deep in the budget reports, that's what those are.
And will the crossing remain in there for 2027?
I'm sorry, do what?
Mission Crossing will remain in there for 2027?
I thought the TIF retired, but the CID is still in
Yeah.
place. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you actually go read if you have a bunch of free time on your hands and check out the detailed monthly interim report with the full, if you'll look in there, there's the sub categories actually say there's a TIF and a CID piece in there still. So, and that is one of the other things with our extremely antiquated accounting system is if it was put in, it stays in. So that's part of that as well. So. I think that was your last slide.
And I know on this slide, Laura, we mentioned the business improvement grant, and my understanding is that was better utilized this year by our businesses. Is that right for 2026 or Justin? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's been a while since we've had a business who wanted to take advantage. We've actually got, we'll be featuring them here shortly. So Rock Creek Brewing Company, Barber's Den. But where we've seen the increase in access and usage is the citizen rebate.
I did want to talk about that
Citizen
too.
rebate program. So you all expanded and changed some of the parameters. And then we did some really specific sort of targeting and marketing of that program. And we've seen an increase. We were spending about $25,000 annually. And I think we've increased that to 40 or 50 in the 2027 budget, just based on the
Yeah.
participation.
And that's our residential property rebate program that you're referring to for single family homes, right?
Yes, so income qualified households
Yeah.
are able to have a significant portion of their franchise fees and property taxes rebated to them.
Great. Yeah, Wanda?
I just want to say I'm very impressed with the detail and the optics. I mean, I hate numbers, but this really brings it to me. I mean, you really did a great job. I have to applaud you for that.
Thank you, and we'll fix the slide. The outside resources secured slide on the back of the budget and brief sheet is correct.
Yeah.
We had a gajillion versions of things floating around today, so.
And Laura, I did just want to make one additional note on the property tax rebate program, because I know we discussed it in greater detail, I think last year when we expanded the program, but also when we had that mill levy increase. And
Yes.
so I know that was part of the policy discussion at the time, was thinking about how we could maintain overall services and quality of life that our residents demand in the face of increasing costs, while making sure we're not leaving our most vulnerable residents behind, and offering assistance and really trying to promote that assistance to folks who might need it. Yeah.
The one thing I didn't touch on, and it's in one of these documents somewhere, was that, and you have it later on your agenda this evening, was looking at that $1.50 a month increase in the solid waste contribution for every single family residential home. So $18 a year. As we talked about in previous budget presentations, the city for the last about 5 years has absorbed 100% of the contractual increases. So this is just a little bit of rebalancing. We're still subsidizing about $75,000 of that contract.
Any other questions or
Questions or
comments for the community dialogue portion? Yeah, Debbie?
If I remember correctly, it was either last council meeting or the one before, it was brought up that there's a potential to start getting additional revenue from the tickets that we're giving at the court level. And those kind of things are real important, I think, for the community to understand. That's a revenue source for us, and it's kind of combating some of the problems we've had with people going through red lights and speeding and everything through the residential areas as well as Johnson Drive. So if we could expand on that at some point in the next couple months in a newsletter or
Sure.
magazine or something, I think that's a great way.
Yeah.
And that's something I most.
And that's one of those sort of tricky ones, because the actual revenue associated with the work, I think Justin referenced some of the things that the municipal court in particular has been doing to increase collections. But I think you're looking at, I think 2026 budget was about $20,000, and that's not insignificant, but trying to, make sure, I think that tells a good story too, of that every dollar matters, and that our employees are continually looking for ways to be able to save those and generate those savings.
Thank you.
All right. With that, we will conclude our work session.
I didn't know.
Oh, yes, I should ask, does anyone who's come in, anyone else have questions from the public? We will also have the budget again on the agenda at our 7 o'clock meeting. All right. That concludes our meeting.